Imagine for a moment. You wake up on a morning in the middle of July, but something is terribly wrong. You feel not the gentle warmth of summer, but a biting, unnatural chill that seeps through the walls. You pull your blankets tighter, a gesture that belongs to the deep winter months. Outside your window, a scene of profound confusion unfolds. It is snowing. The flakes are not a flurry, but a steady, silent descent, blanketing the green world in a ghostly white. The sun, when it appears at all, is a stranger. It is a pale, dim disk in a sky that never turns fully blue, but lingers in a sickly yellow haze. The world is cast in a permanent, eerie twilight. For months, this has been your reality. The crops in the fields are failing, their leaves blackened by frost. A strange, persistent dry fog hangs in the air, a shroud that muffles sound and obscures the horizon. Fear and confusion are spreading through your community, spreading faster than the cold. People whisper in hushed tones, in their homes and in their churches. They ask the same questions to which no one has an answer. Why has the sun abandoned us? Why has summer been stolen? It feels as though the world itself is coming to an end. This was not a nightmare. This was the waking reality for millions of people in the year 1816. They were living through a terrifying mystery, a year without a summer. In our journey tonight, we will not just learn about this forgotten year. We will try to live through it. We will piece together the puzzle from the letters and diaries of those who endured the darkness. Together, we will uncover the colossal, cataclysmic event on the other side of the world that triggered it all. So, I invite you to settle in. Find your comfort in the quiet of this moment. Relax, and let the story of the year the sun vanished gently unfold. Our story begins not with the cause, but with the consequence. It begins with the simple, bewildering experience of being alive in a world turned upside down. We begin our journey in North America, specifically in the region known as New England. The year is 1816. The people here are hardy, accustomed to long winters and the struggle of taming a rocky landscape. But they are also accustomed to the rhythm of the seasons, a rhythm that has governed life for generations. Winter gives way to spring. The thaw comes, the ground softens, and the promise of a harvest is born. Spring then blossoms into summer, a time of warmth, growth, and light. This rhythm is the foundation of their survival, their economy, and their faith. It is a sacred, unbroken pact between humanity and the heavens. In 1816, that pact was broken. The year had already felt strange. The winter had been cold, but not unusually so. Yet the spring that followed was stubborn and reluctant. The warmth did not arrive as it should have. The month of April was unseasonably cold. May was even worse, marked by a series of sharp frosts that bit at the newly planted seedlings. Farmers, accustomed to the whims of nature, replanted their crops with weary patience. They looked to the sky, hoping for the familiar heat of June to finally set things right. They prayed for the sun to reclaim its dominion, to pour its golden warmth upon the fields of corn, beans, and squash. June would surely bring the summer they so desperately needed. But June did not bring summer. It brought a cold that was alien, a cold that felt like a betrayal. On the 6th of that month, the temperature plummeted. A dark, heavy sky unleashed not rain, but snow. Imagine the profound shock of it. Waking in your farmhouse in Vermont or Massachusetts, and seeing the green leaves of the maple trees heavy with a layer of fresh snow. The storm raged for days in some places, a blizzard in the heart of summer. Ice formed on ponds and rivers, thick enough to bear a person's weight. The young shoots of corn, a vital crop, turned black and wilted in the fields. The kitchen gardens, so carefully tended, were frozen solid. The people of New England were stunned into a state of quiet dread. This was not just a freak weather event. This felt biblical. It felt like a sign, a punishment from a displeased God. Diaries from the period are filled with entries of disbelief and fear. A physician in New Hampshire wrote of the melancholy and unseasonable weather. He noted that the sheep, recently shorn of their winter wool, perished from the cold in great numbers. Newly hatched birds, unprepared for such a frost, were found frozen in their nests. The very air, which should have been filled with the drone of insects and the song of birds, was eerily silent. The world had become a still, cold, and quiet place. As the days of June passed, the sun remained a watery, impotent disk in the sky. When it did shine, its rays carried no heat. People wore their winter coats and huddled by their fireplaces, a bizarre scene for a season that should have demanded open windows and cool shade. The psychological toll was immense. The rhythm of life had been shattered. The familiar cues of nature were gone, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. Every sunrise was met with apprehension. Would today be the day the warmth returned? Or would the unnatural cold persist, tightening its grip on their world and on their future? The foundations of their reality were cracking. This was what they called the poverty year, or more grimly, 1800 and froze to death. The immediate concern was food. The repeated frosts had all but destroyed the corn crop, which was the staple food for both families and their livestock. The hay crop was stunted, growing to only a few inches instead of a few feet. This meant there would be little fodder for the cattle and horses to survive the coming winter, a winter that everyone now feared would be unimaginably harsh. The price of grain began to climb at an alarming rate. A bushel of corn, which had been affordable just months before, was now becoming a luxury. Merchants who had grain in storage began to hoard their supplies, anticipating even higher prices. This created panic and resentment among the common people. Food riots, though small, began to break out in some towns. It was a quiet, desperate kind of social unraveling. Neighbors eyed each other's dwindling supplies with suspicion. The sense of community, so vital for survival in these rural towns, was being strained to its breaking point. People began to make impossible choices. Do they slaughter their precious livestock now because they cannot afford to feed them? Or do they hold on, praying for a miraculous turn in the weather that seemed less and less likely with each passing frigid day? The chill was more than just physical. It was a spiritual cold. On Sundays, churches were filled with people praying for deliverance. Sermons were filled with dark portents and calls for repentance. Ministers and their congregations searched for a reason, for some sin or failing that could explain this divine punishment. Had their society become too proud? Had the recent wars angered the Almighty? These questions hung heavy in the air, as thick as the strange, dry fog that so often filled the valleys. This fog was another baffling piece of the puzzle. It was not a damp, wet mist, but a hazy veil that dimmed the light and seemed to have no earthly source. The sky itself became a source of both fear and a strange, mournful beauty. The sunsets were unnaturally spectacular. Because of the mysterious haze in the upper atmosphere, the setting sun would paint the horizon in vivid, fiery colors. Streaks of intense red, orange, and purple would linger long after the pale disk had vanished. For an artist, it might have been a marvel. But for the farmer standing in his frozen field, it was just another sign that the heavens were disturbed. The beauty was the beauty of a fever, a sign of a deep sickness in the world. It offered no warmth, and it promised no relief from the encroaching hunger and despair. This despair began to curdle into a grim resolve. For many, the land itself now seemed cursed. New England, with its rocky soil and unforgiving climate, had always demanded hard work. But it had always rewarded that work with a harvest, however meager. Now the land had betrayed them. It offered only frozen ground and withered plants. In the minds of many farmers, a seed of a different kind began to sprout. It was the idea of leaving. The idea of abandoning their ancestral homes, their communities, and everything they had ever known. Whispers began to circulate of better lands to the west, in places like Ohio and Indiana. These were lands rumored to be more fertile, more forgiving. Lands where perhaps the sun still shone with its proper warmth. The thought of uprooting an entire family and trekking hundreds of miles into the wilderness was a daunting one. It was a choice born not of ambition, but of pure desperation. To stay meant facing a winter with empty granaries and starving livestock. It meant watching your children grow thin and pale. To leave was a tremendous gamble, a leap into the unknown. Yet as the cold summer of 1816 wore on, that gamble began to seem like the only viable option for survival. The great westward migration was about to be fueled by a mysterious global winter. But the people of New England were not alone in their suffering. They could not have known it at the time, cut off as they were by the slow pace of communication. But the same strange twilight, the same unnatural chill, was being felt thousands of miles away. Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the continent of Europe was also falling under the shadow of this mysterious global event. The very same atmospheric veil that dimmed the sun over Vermont was also casting a pall over the ancient cities and verdant countrysides of the Old World. We must now turn our attention there to see how this bizarre summer unfolded on the other side of the world. In Europe, the suffering was not one of frost and snow, but of water and mud. The same stratospheric haze that blocked the sun's warmth did not stop the rain. In fact, it seemed to encourage it. From Ireland to Switzerland, the summer of 1816 was a season of endless, bone-chilling downpours. Rivers swelled and burst their banks, flooding fertile farmlands and turning roads into impassable quagmires of mud. In Great Britain and Ireland, the potato crop, a cornerstone of the diet for the poor, blackened with rot in the perpetually damp soil. The wheat harvest failed, the grain heads drooping and mildewed before they could ever ripen. The sky was a near-permanent ceiling of gray. This was the beggar summer. In Germany, which was not yet a unified nation, but a patchwork of states, the crisis was severe. The incessant rains caused the Rhine River to flood repeatedly, washing away crops, homes, and livestock. The price of bread, the staple of life, soared beyond the reach of ordinary people. Desperate families took to the roads, becoming wandering beggars, a common and heartbreaking sight across the continent. They moved from town to town, searching for charity or a rumored place where the famine was less severe. But there was no escape. The cold and the rain were everywhere, a relentless oppression that suffocated hope and fostered a deep societal despair. The same strange, beautiful sunsets that were seen in America also appeared in Europe. The English Romantic painter, J.M.W. Turner, was captivated by them. His canvases from this period exploded with brilliant yellows, oranges, and reds. He painted skies that looked bruised and feverish, filled with a dramatic, hazy light. While others saw only the gloom, Turner saw a new kind of sublime and terrifying beauty. His art serves as a unique record of the chemical composition of the sky during that strange year. He was painting the fine veil of volcanic aerosols, a phenomenon he could see and feel, but whose origin remained a profound and impenetrable mystery to everyone on Earth. Perhaps nowhere was the gloom more concentrated or more creatively fertile than on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Here, a group of young, brilliant, and restless English writers found themselves trapped by the weather. They had come seeking the sublime beauty of the Alps, but the mountains were almost permanently hidden behind a wall of mist and cloud. Lord Byron, the famous and scandalous poet, had rented the Villa Diodati. His guests included the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, his young lover Mary Godwin, and her stepsister Claire Clairmont. Byron's personal physician, the thoughtful and ambitious John Polidori, was also in attendance. They were prisoners in a lakeside paradise. The weather that summer was abysmal. Day after day, they were confined indoors by what Mary would later call an almost perpetual rain. They would watch from the villa's windows as violent thunderstorms rolled across the lake, illuminating the churning black water with spectacular flashes of lightning. The unseasonable cold forced them to keep fires roaring in the hearth. To pass the time, they read. They talked late into the night, their conversations fueled by wine and intellectual curiosity. They discussed the latest scientific theories about electricity and the principle of life, ideas that were capturing the European imagination. The gloomy, apocalyptic atmosphere of the world outside seeped into their conversations and into their creative minds. One evening, as another storm raged outside, Byron made a proposal. He suggested that they each try to write a ghost story. The idea was met with enthusiasm. For several days, The young writers tried to conjure tales of horror to match the unsettling mood of their surroundings. But it was 18-year-old Mary Godwin who struggled at first. She wanted to write a story that would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror. For days, she could think of nothing. The pressure mounted. Then, one night, after listening to Byron and Shelley discuss the possibility of reanimating a corpse, Mary drifted into a waking dream. She saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life. The image terrified her. The idea of a creature brought to life by human ambition, but abandoned by its creator, took hold of her imagination. She had found her story. The endless rain, the chilling conversations, and the profound gloom of the year without a summer had created the perfect crucible for her masterpiece. The novel she began to write would be called Frankenstein, a story that would define a new genre and haunt the world for centuries. While Mary was conceiving her monster, the psychological toll of the year without a summer was weighing heavily on the general population. The crisis felt elemental, a fundamental wrongness in the world that science, in its infant state, could not explain. In the absence of a rational cause, many people turned to supernatural explanations. This was, in their minds, an act of God. It was a clear sign of divine wrath, a punishment for the sins of humanity. Europe had just endured more than a decade of brutal warfare under Napoleon. Perhaps this was the final reckoning, a judgment not of fire, but of cold and darkness. This belief spurred a wave of religious fervor across the continent. In towns in Italy and Switzerland, religious processions snaked through the streets. People marched barefoot, flogging themselves and praying for mercy. They carried sacred relics and sang somber hymns, hoping to appease an angry God. Church bells, which normally rang to mark the time or to celebrate, now told to call the faithful to special prayers for an end to the rain and the return of the sun. The atmosphere was one of shared guilt and collective dread. The very air felt heavy with a sense of impending doom, as if they were living through the final pages of the book of Revelation. But not everyone was content with purely religious explanations. In the coffee houses and salons of Europe, a more secular and scientific kind of speculation was taking place. Newspapers and pamphlets of the time were filled with theories. One of the most popular culprits was sunspots. Astronomers had observed an unusual number of dark spots on the surface of the sun in the preceding years. Many writers and thinkers latched onto this idea. They proposed that these spots were diminishing the sun's heat and light, causing the strange weather on Earth. It was a plausible theory, one that seemed to fit the evidence of the pale, weak sun. Other theories were more fanciful. Some blamed the recent experiments with electricity, particularly the lightning rod, which was still a relatively new invention. They argued that these metal rods, by drawing lightning from the sky, were somehow upsetting the natural atmospheric balance. Others pointed to earthquakes, or even to the passage of a distant comet. These theories, while incorrect, reveal a society grappling with a terrifying mystery. They show a human need to find patterns, to identify a cause, even a mistaken one. To have no explanation at all was the most frightening possibility. It suggested that the world was not governed by understandable laws, but by a chaotic and malevolent randomness. This blend of scientific curiosity and apocalyptic fear created a deeply unsettled social landscape. Trust in institutions, both scientific and religious, began to fray. When prayers went unanswered and scientific theories failed to provide a solution, people were left with only their own fear and superstitions. The crisis was not just agricultural or economic. It was existential. It challenged people's fundamental understanding of their place in the universe. The predictable and benevolent world they thought they inhabited had been replaced by one that was hostile, strange, and utterly mystifying. The sun, the very symbol of life and reason, had become a cold and distant stranger. As we conclude this first part of our journey, we leave the world of 1816 suspended in this state of profound confusion. From the farmer in his frozen New England field, to the beggar on a muddy German road, to the young writer dreaming of monsters by a Swiss lake, all were united by a shared experience they could not comprehend. They were living under the same veiled sun, breathing the same chilled air, and asking the same desperate questions. They had no way of knowing that the answer did not lie in the heavens above or in the sins of humanity below, but thousands of miles away in an event that had already occurred, a cataclysm of unimaginable scale whose consequences were now holding the entire planet hostage. A twilight summer had reached its peak. The mystery was absolute. Perhaps you, too, can feel a whisper of that ancient chill, a faint echo of that deep confusion as you settle in tonight. The darkness they experienced was real, but like all darkness, it had a source. In the next part of our story, we will travel back in time and across the globe. We will journey to a remote tropical island to witness the awesome and terrifying power of the earth itself. We will find the mountain of fire that stole the sun. And finally, you will begin to understand the reason for the year without a summer. For now, let the mystery rest. To understand the great darkness of 1816, we must leave that cold, bewildering year behind us. Our journey now takes us backward in time to the year before, 1815. We must also travel across the entire globe, from the familiar landscapes of Europe and North America to the tropical waters of the Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia. Here, on a remote island, a colossal force of nature was stirring from a long slumber. It was a force so immense, it would hold the entire planet in its grip. The answer to the mystery of the twilight summer lies here, in a mountain of fire.r. Destination is the island of Samboa. In the early 19th century, it was a lush and tranquil place, a jewel in the glittering Indonesian archipelago. The island was covered in dense jungle, alive with the sounds of exotic birds and wildlife. Its volcanic soil was incredibly fertile, supporting a thriving population. Two small kingdoms, Tambora and Picate, flourished on the slopes of the great mountain that dominated the island. The people there cultivated rice, coffee, and spices. They were skilled seafarers and traders, living in harmony with the powerful, jungle-clad mountain that gave them their fertile land. They called the mountain Tambora. For centuries, Mount Tambora had been silent. It was considered a dormant, perhaps even extinct, volcano. But in early April of 1815, the mountain began to stir. Deep within the earth, a massive chamber of magma had been building pressure for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The first signs of its reawakening were subtle. Gentle tremors shook the ground. Then, on April 5th, a moderate eruption sent a column of ash and gas miles into the sky. The sound of this initial blast was tremendous. It carried for hundreds of miles across the Java Sea, a deep, percussive booming sound that was mistaken for cannon fire. In Java, hundreds of miles to the west, the British Lieutenant Governor, Sir Stamford Raffles, heard the reports. He and his officials were convinced they were hearing a naval battle, or perhaps an attack on a remote outpost. Anxious to investigate, Raffles dispatched reconnaissance ships to search for the source of the mysterious explosions. The ships sailed for days, but found no signs of a battle. The booming sounds continued, a deep and unsettling thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once. The air grew thick with a fine, falling ash, a sign that something far more significant than a human conflict was unfolding. Then, on the evening of April 10th, the true cataclysm was unleashed. Mount Tambora erupted with a violence that is almost beyond human comprehension. With a sound that would later be confirmed as the loudest in all of recorded history, the mountain simply blew itself apart. A column of fire, rock, and ash surged into the heavens, reaching an altitude of more than 25 miles, penetrating deep into the stratosphere. The sound was heard distinctly over 1,000 miles away. On the island of Sumatra, it was so loud that people thought it was the sound of the world ending. For the people living on Sumatra, the eruption triggered what is known as a pyroclastic flow, a superheated cloud of gas, ash, and rock, hotter than an oven, and moving at hurricane speeds, swept down the mountainside. It was a churning, inescapable wave of incandescent death. In a matter of minutes, the kingdoms of Tambora and Picate were completely annihilated, their people and villages incinerated and buried under dozens of feet of hot ash and pumice. The wave of destruction did not stop at the shore. It rushed out over the sea, its heat creating steam that scalded the sailors on nearby ships. The darkness that followed was absolute. For 3 full days, a region of several hundred miles around Tambora was plunged into a state of total pitch-black darkness. The sun was completely extinguished by the thick blanket of falling ash. Sir Stamford Raffles later collected accounts from survivors. They described a terrifying darkness where you could not see your own hand in front of your face. Houses collapsed under the weight of the accumulated ash. The air was thick and unbreathable. There was no day, no night, only an endless suffocating blackness, punctuated by the roar of the volcano and the terrifying glow of lightning within the ash cloud. It was a vision of hell on earth. To truly grasp the power of this event, we need to understand its scale. Volcanologists use a metric called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. It is a logarithmic scale from 0 to 8, meaning each whole number represents an eruption 10 times more powerful than the last. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state was a VEI 5. It was a powerful and destructive event that captured the world's attention. The eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79, which famously buried the Roman city of Pompeii, was also a VEI 5. They were mighty events, but they were not in the same league as Tambora. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, another Indonesian volcano, was a VEI 6. It was a colossal explosion that killed tens of thousands and created a sound heard 3,000 miles away. Its effects on the global climate were noted for years. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 was a VEI 7. It was an order of magnitude more powerful than Krakatoa. It ejected an estimated 150 cubic kilometers of pulverized rock, ash, and gas into the atmosphere. To put that number in perspective, it is enough material to cover the entire island of Great Britain in a layer of dust nearly 2 feet deep. In the immediate aftermath, the local devastation was almost total. The island of Sumbawa was transformed from a green paradise into a gray, barren wasteland. The pyroclastic flows had sterilized the land completely. The surrounding ocean was choked with enormous floating rafts of pumice stone, some of them miles long. These rafts were so thick that they formed a floating barrier, making it impossible for ships to approach the island for months. The eruption also triggered tsunamis that washed over the shores of neighboring islands, adding to the death toll. Of the 12,000 people living in the kingdom of Tambora, only a handful are thought to have survived. The immediate human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands were killed instantly by the eruption and its direct effects. In the weeks and months that followed, tens of thousands more would perish from starvation and disease on Sumbawa and the surrounding islands. Their crops were buried, their drinking water was contaminated, and the air was thick with volcanic dust that caused severe respiratory illnesses. It was one of the greatest human tragedies caused by a volcanic eruption in history. But the impact of Tambora was not confined to its immediate vicinity. The worst of its effects were yet to come, and they would be felt on a truly global scale. The local devastation, as terrible as it was caused by the heavy ash and rock that fell back to Earth relatively quickly. But the key to the mystery of 1816, the key to the year without a summer, was not what fell down. It was what stayed up. Tambora had injected a massive plume of material high into the stratosphere, a stable, weatherless layer of the atmosphere far above the clouds. And within that plume was not just ash, but a vast quantity of an invisible gas. This gas was the true messenger of Tambora's power. It was the agent that would carry the volcano's chilling effects to every corner of the planet. This gas was sulfur dioxide, or SO2, while the heavy ash particles fell out of the sky within weeks or months. The sulfur dioxide gas was different. It was light, It rose into the stratosphere, and it stayed there. Once in this high, stable layer of the atmosphere, a slow chemical reaction began to take place. The sulfur dioxide molecules combined with water vapor, which is also present in the stratosphere. Through this process, they were transformed into tiny droplets, or aerosols, of sulfuric acid. These droplets were incredibly small, far too small to see with the naked eye. But there were trillions upon trillions of them. Slowly, over the months following the eruption, these sulfate aerosols formed a vast, thin, and invisible mist. This was not like a normal cloud. It did not sit in one place. It was caught by the high-altitude stratospheric winds, the jet streams, and began to spread. Like a dye dropped into a basin of water, the aerosol veil began its slow, inexorable journey around the globe. It spread westward and eastward from Indonesia, gradually encircling the tropics. Then, over the course of the following year, atmospheric currents carried it north and south towards the poles. By early 1816, a year after the eruption, this gossamer thin shroud of volcanic aerosols had enveloped the entire planet. This planetary shroud was the true culprit behind the year without a summer. It was subtle, almost entirely invisible to the naked eye, but its effect on the Earth's climate was profound. The trillions of tiny sulfuric acid droplets acted like a global sunshade. They did not block the sun's light entirely, but they reflected a small, critical percentage of it back into space before it could reach and warm the surface of the planet. This phenomenon is known as increasing the Earth's albedo, or its reflectivity. The change was small, perhaps only a 1 or 2% reduction in solar energy. But that was enough. When this slight reduction in energy is applied across the entire surface of the globe, day after day, for several years, the result is a significant drop in average global temperatures. Modern climate models estimate that Tambora's veil caused the Earth to cool by about 1 degree Celsius, or nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. This may not sound like much. We experience much larger temperature swings in a single day, but a 1 degree drop in the planet's average temperature is a massive climate shift. It is enough to disrupt weather patterns, to shorten growing seasons, and to bring frost and snow to places where they have no business being in the middle of summer. The reason the effect lasted for so long is due to the unique nature of the stratosphere. The lower layer of our atmosphere, the troposphere, is where we live. It is where all our weather happens. It is full of wind, rain, and storms. Any dust or pollution in the troposphere gets washed out by rain in a matter of days or weeks, but the stratosphere, which lies above the weather, is incredibly stable. It is calm and dry. There is no rain to wash particles away. Once the sulfate aerosols formed in this layer, they were stranded there with nowhere to go. They could only be removed by slowly, very slowly, settling out due to gravity, a process that takes several years. And so, the stage was set for the true global tragedy of 1816, the invisible chemical reaction that occurred high above the Earth was now directly connected to the suffering of the people below. All of the strange and terrifying phenomena described in the letters and diaries from that year can be explained by this single persistent stratospheric veil. The mystery that had baffled an entire generation finally had a solution, one that they themselves could never have imagined. The dim, weak sun, the unnatural cold, the strange fogs, and even the beautiful sunsets were all symptoms of the same planetary affliction. Let us first consider the cold. The global cooling effect directly explains the summer snows that fell on New England. It explains the killing frosts in June that destroyed the corn crop. The shortened, weakened summer season simply did not have enough warmth to sustain agriculture in many northern regions. In Europe, this cooling disrupted the normal flow of weather patterns. It led to a persistent stream of cold, wet air from the Atlantic, causing the endless rains and floods. The planet's entire heat engine had been throttled back, and the consequences were being felt everywhere, in different but equally devastating ways. Then there was the pale, sickly sun. The aerosol veil did more than just reflect sunlight. It also scattered it. Light that would normally travel in a direct path to the Earth was instead bounced around by the tiny droplets in the stratosphere. This made the sun itself appear less brilliant, less focused. It was often described as being visible through a haze, a watery disk that you could sometimes look at directly without discomfort. This scattered light is also what created the strange, perpetual twilight. The sky was not a deep blue because the aerosol layer was scattering all wavelengths of light, creating a whitish or yellowish haze that persisted from dawn until dusk. This same haze explains the phenomenon of the dry fogs. These were not fogs in the normal sense, made of condensed water vapor near the ground. They were an optical illusion, the effect of looking at the landscape through the thickest, lowest part of the stratospheric veil. It was most noticeable in the mornings and evenings, and in valleys, where one would be looking through more of the atmosphere horizontally. This persistent haze, which seemed to have no source and never burned off, was one of the most psychologically unsettling aspects of the year, a constant visible reminder that the very air itself was unwell, and finally, the spectacular sunsets. This, too, was a direct result of the aerosol layer. When the sun is low on the horizon, at sunrise or sunset, its light has to travel through much more of the atmosphere to reach our eyes. As it passes through the Tambora veil, the tiny droplets are especially good at scattering the shorter, blue wavelengths of light. This allows the longer red and orange wavelengths to pass through much more effectively. The result was a sky that would light up in fiery, dramatic colors. The beautiful sunsets, painted by Turner and wondered at by farmers, were the final optical signature of the volcanic sulfur high above. The mystery was solved. The supernatural fears, the talk of divine punishment, the theories about sunspots, all of it was wrong. The cause was terrestrial. It was a simple, yet powerful, chain of events. A volcanic eruption, a plume of gas, a chemical reaction in the stratosphere, and a resulting veil that cooled the earth. The people of 1816 were not being punished by God. They were the unfortunate victims of a planetary-scale industrial accident, with a volcano acting as the factory. They were living and dying in the shadow of a mountain, half a world away. As we journey through this explanation, allow the complexities of our world to gently wash over you. There is a kind of deep comfort in understanding. The universe, which had seemed so chaotic and malevolent to the people of 1816, was in fact operating on principles of physics and chemistry. The connections are vast and intricate, but they are understandable. A volcano in Indonesia can, and did, change the course of life for a family in Vermont. This profound interconnectedness is one of the central truths of our existence on this planet, a lesson that the year without a summer taught with brutal efficiency. With the cause now revealed, and the mystery of the strange weather solved, our story must turn back to the people on the ground. Understanding the signs is one thing. Living through the consequences is another. The global cooling and the disruption of the seasons was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a trigger for a worldwide humanitarian crisis. It led to famine, disease, social unrest, and mass migration. The next part of our journey will explore this human fallout. We will see how different societies buckled under the strain, and how, in some cases, the darkness gave birth to unexpected flashes of creativity. And innovation. The mountain of fire had done its work. The global veil was in place. The sun was dimmed, and the world was cold. The stage was now set for a human drama of epic proportions. The story of 1816 is more than just a story about a volcano. It is a story about humanity. It is about our fragility in the face of nature's power. It is about our ability to endure hardship, to adapt to new and terrifying circumstances, and to create meaning and even beauty in the darkest of times. The chilling effects of Tambora would ripple through every aspect of society, changing the world in ways that are still being felt to this very day. As we conclude the second part of our story, let the explanation settle. The frightening mystery of the twilight summer now has a name: Tambora. The ghostly phenomena now have a physical cause in the stratospheric veil. The world of 1816, which seemed to be breaking its own rules, was in fact following deeper, more powerful rules of atmospheric science. In the next chapter of our journey, we will witness the profound human consequences of this great natural event. We will explore a world gripped by hunger, but also a world on the cusp of invention and artistic creation. For now, rest with this understanding. A puzzle has been solved. The Veil of Tambora was more than a scientific curiosity. It was a catalyst for a global human crisis. With the sun's warmth diminished and the seasons thrown into chaos, the very foundation of civilization, agriculture, began to crumble. The year without a summer triggered what many historians call the last great subsistence crisis of the Western world. It was a time of profound hunger, desperation, and social upheaval. But it was also a time that sparked remarkable acts of migration and gave birth to astonishing feats of creativity. Our story now turns to the human heart, to a world struggling to survive in the shadow of the volcano dot. The suffering was most acute in places that were already vulnerable. In the collection of German states, the year 1816 became known as the Year of the Beggar. The relentless cold and rain led to a catastrophic failure of the grain and potato crops. The price of bread, the food that sustained the poor, quadrupled. In a single year, panic buying and hoarding by those with means made the situation even worse. Governments tried to intervene by fixing prices and distributing emergency grain, but their efforts were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Soon, the granaries were empty, and there was nothing left to distribute. The stories from this period are heartbreaking. People were forced to eat whatever they could find. They ate cats, rats, and the boiled roots of weeds. There are accounts of people grinding sawdust to mix with their flour and eating hay and moss. The roads became crowded with skeletal figures, entire families leaving their villages in a desperate search for food. These wandering beggars overwhelmed the towns, which had no resources to help them. It was a slow, agonizing famine, a crisis that dissolved social bonds and reduced life to a primal, daily struggle for a single loaf of bread or a handful of grain. In Switzerland, the situation was just as grim. The country was hemmed in by the Alps, its mountain passes blocked by unseasonable snow, making it nearly impossible to import food. The Swiss people felt trapped in a beautiful but deadly prison. Food riots broke out in several cities. Desperate mobs attacked bakeries and stormed grain markets. The government declared a national emergency, but there was little they could do against the relentless weather. The nation that would later become a symbol of prosperity and stability was, in 1816, on the very brink of total societal collapse, brought low by a climate it could not control. Across the Channel in Ireland, the disaster took on a particularly grim form. The failure of the potato crop, caused by the endless cold rain and lack of sunlight, was devastating. For the vast rural poor of Ireland, the potato was not just a staple, it was often their only source of food. As the crop rotted in the fields, malnutrition quickly set in, weakening the population on a massive scale. And into this vulnerable population, disease followed. A major epidemic of typhus, a disease that thrives in conditions of poverty and poor sanitation, swept across the country. This combination of famine and pestilence was a horrifying dress rehearsal for the even great famine that would strike Ireland just a few decades later. The reach of Tambora's chill was truly global, extending far beyond Europe. In the Yunnan province of southwestern China, the cold weather decimated the rice harvest for 3 consecutive years. Rice paddies, which rely on a long, warm, and wet growing season, simply could not produce in the altered climate. The result was a catastrophic famine that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. In their desperation, farmers abandoned the cultivation of rice. They turned to a crop that was more resilient to the cold and far more profitable as a source of cash to buy food: the opium poppy. This agricultural shift had enormous and tragic consequences for China's future. fueling the opium trade that would destabilize the nation for a century. In the face of such widespread crop failure and starvation, many people saw only one path forward: to leave. This was especially true in North America. For the farmers of New England, the year of 1800 froze to death was the final blow. They had struggled for generations with rocky soil and a challenging climate. But the complete failure of the 1816 harvest broke their will. The land, which their families had worked for decades, now seemed cursed beyond redemption. To stay meant facing another winter with no food, no money, and no hope. The promise of the American frontier, which had always been a distant dream, suddenly became a desperate necessity. A phenomenon known as Ohio fever swept through the region. Letters from friends and relatives who had already moved west, and advertisements from land speculators painted a picture of a new promised land. They spoke of the Ohio Valley, a place with deep, fertile soil, milder seasons, and cheap land. For a family facing starvation in Vermont, the stories seemed almost too good to be true. They described a place where corn grew tall and the land practically gave away its bounty. The decision to leave was agonizing. It meant abandoning homes, churches, and the graves of their ancestors. But the pull of survival was stronger than the pull of home. And so the great exodus began. In the spring and summer of 1817, after the worst of the cold had passed, but with the famine still raging, the roads leading out of New England were crowded with families on the move. They packed their meager possessions into canvas-topped wagons, or even simple handcarts. They brought their tools, their seeds, and whatever livestock had survived the winter. It was a massive demographic shift, the largest migration out of New England in its history. These were not adventurers seeking riches. They were climate refugees, fleeing a homeland that could no longer sustain them. This migration dramatically accelerated the westward expansion of the United States. Entire towns in New England were hollowed out, their populations dwindling as families sought new lives on the frontier. The journey itself was arduous and dangerous, a trek of hundreds of miles over rough terrain. But the hope of a better life, of a place where summer was still summer, drove them onward. They were unknowingly following the path of the sun, heading west toward a future they prayed would be warmer and more bountiful. This mass movement would reshape the American landscape, both physically and politically, for generations to come. While many sought their salvation in migration, others found it through invention. The crisis forced people to think in new ways, to solve problems that had never existed before. One of the most pressing issues, particularly in Europe, was the lack of transportation. The famine had not only affected humans, it had devastated the horse population. The oats required to feed horses had failed just like the wheat and potatoes. The price of horse feed skyrocketed, and vast numbers of horses either starved to death or were slaughtered for their meat. This created a transportation crisis. For the first time, people had to imagine a world without the horse as the primary engine of movement. In the German state of Baden, a clever and eccentric aristocrat named Baron Karl von Drey was grappling with this very problem. A civil servant with a passion for mechanics, Dre was troubled by the suffering he saw around him. He witnessed the difficulty of transporting food and goods without horses. He decided to create a personal, mechanical mode of transportation that did not require a living engine. His solution was a stroke of genius in its simplicity. It was a wooden frame with two wheels, a steerable front wheel, and a padded seat. There were no pedals, no chains, no gears. It was a walking machine. The rider would sit on the frame and push off the ground with their feet, gliding forward in a running motion. Dre called his invention the Loft Massing, which means running machine. It was later nicknamed the Drezine, or the Velocipede. In the summer of 1817, he made his first public journey, traveling 8 miles in just under an hour. This was a remarkable speed, faster than a mail coach. The invention was a direct response to the crisis created by Tambora, the death of horses caused by the failure of the oat crop had given birth to the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle. The velocipede became a short-lived craze among the wealthy dandies of Germany, France, and Britain. It was a novelty, a fun toy for aristocrats, but its deeper significance was immense. It was the first time a personal, two-wheeled vehicle had been introduced to the world. It decoupled human transportation from the muscle of an animal. While it would take several more decades and the addition of pedals and chains to create the bicycle we know today, the fundamental idea was born from the hunger and necessity of 1817. It was a remarkable flash of ingenuity, a mechanical solution to a problem created by a distant volcano. This pattern of darkness giving rise to unexpected light is a recurring theme in the story of 1816. The same gloomy, oppressive weather that drove farmers from their land and inventors to their workshops was also fueling an unprecedented cultural boom. We must now return to the shores of Lake Geneva, to the villa where a group of young English writers were trapped by the endless rain. We have already seen how the morbid atmosphere inspired Mary Shelley to dream of her famous monster. But the creative explosion that happened in that house went even further, shaping not one, but two of the most enduring archetypes in modern fiction. The ghost story competition at the Villa Diodati was more than just a parlor game. It was an act of creative defiance against the oppressive gloom. While Mary Shelley was wrestling with her vision of the abandoned monster, the others were at work on their own tales. Percy Shelley wrote a short piece based on his early life experiences. Lord Byron, ever the leader, began a story about a mysterious and world-weary aristocrat on his travels. But he quickly grew bored with the tale and abandoned it after writing only a fragment. He had planted a seed, however, that would be cultivated by another member of the group, Dr. John Polidori. Byron's young physician watched his famous patient with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Byron was brilliant, charismatic, and moody, a magnetic personality who dominated every room he entered. Polidori was fascinated by Byron's abandoned story fragment. He was also deeply inspired by Byron himself. He saw in the poet a living embodiment of the dark, brooding hero. Polidori took the basic idea from Byron's Fragment and began to secretly develop it into his own, much more complete story. The result would be a tale called The Vampire. Polidori's story was revolutionary. Before 1816, the vampire of European folklore was a crude and repulsive creature. It was typically a shambling, mindless corpse that rose from its grave in a peasant village to terrorize the local population. It was a beast, not a character. Polidori's creation, Lord Ruthven, was entirely different. He was charming, intelligent, and moved easily through high society. He was an aristocrat whose sinister nature was hidden behind a mask of sophistication and allure. He was, in almost every respect, a thinly veiled portrait of Lord Byron himself. With Lord Ruthven, Polidori invented the modern vampire dot. It is an astonishing fact of literary history. In the same house, during the same dark and stormy summer, two of the most enduring monsters of modern culture were born. Mary Shelley's Preacher, a product of scientific ambition gone wrong, gave birth to the genre of science fiction. Polidori's Vampire, a seductive and dangerous aristocrat, created the template for a new kind of horror. Both creations were steeped in the anxieties of the age. Both explored themes of isolation, of hidden monstrosity, and of the dark side of human nature. It is hard to imagine that such a creative flourishing could have happened without the unique, oppressive atmosphere of the year without a summer. The gloom of 1816 provided the perfect emotional and physical landscape for the Gothic imagination. The world felt disordered, out of balance. The perpetual twilight, the endless rain, and the dramatic thunderstorms all contributed to a feeling that the veil between the natural and the supernatural had grown thin. The writers at the Villa Diodati were not just describing a fictional mood, they were channeling the very real mood of the world around them. Frankenstein and the vampire are the cultural artifacts of the Tambora climate crisis, as much as the failed crops and the starving beggars. They are monuments of creativity, built in a time of darkness. This dual legacy of suffering and creation is the great paradox of the year without a summer. It was a time of immense human misery on a global scale. The famine and disease it caused left a deep scar on a generation. The mass migrations it triggered permanently altered the demographic map of nations. It was a stark and brutal reminder of how fragile our civilizations are, how utterly dependent we are on a stable and predictable climate. The shadow of the volcano fell over every aspect of life, bringing with it hunger, fear, and death. It was, for many, truly the end of their world. Yet from that same shadow came glimmers of incredible light. The crisis forced humanity to adapt and to innovate. The death of the horse, a tragedy in itself, led directly to the invention of the bicycle, an invention that would one day empower millions. The social and psychological turmoil, the feeling of a world unmoored from its natural rhythms, fueled a period of profound artistic creation. The darkness that confined a group of friends to a Swiss villa gave them the space and the inspiration to dream up stories It would change literature forever. The human spirit, when confronted with overwhelming hardship, did not simply break. It endured, it adapted, and it created. Is a remarkable thing to consider as you rest here tonight. That moments of great darkness can give birth to new light. That from hardship can come ingenuity. That from fear can come art that lasts for centuries. It is a testament to the resilience of the human imagination. If you are still journeying with me now, perhaps you can let that thought bring you a small measure of comfort. The story of 1816 is not just a litany of disasters. It is also a story of survival and of the strange and beautiful things that can grow in the most inhospitable of soils. And so, we leave this world of hunger and creativity, a world reeling from the impact of Tambora's veil. We have seen the devastation of the global famine. We have seen the desperate flight of refugees seeking a better life. We have seen the birth of new machines and new monsters from the crucible of the crisis. For 3 long years, the volcanic shroud held the planet in its grip, altering the course of countless lives. But the veil could not last forever. Like all things, it was subject to the slow and steady laws of nature. The stratosphere could only hold on to its burden for so long. The final part of our story is one of recovery. It is a quiet, reflective chapter about the slow return of the light. We will watch as the ghostly veil begins to thin, and as the familiar blue of the sky and warmth of the sun gradually return to the world. We will explore how the event was remembered, or more accurately, forgotten for over a century before being rediscovered by modern science. And finally, we will reflect on the profound lessons of this forgotten year, lessons about our planet's interconnectedness and our own place within its delicate and powerful systems. The darkest part of the night was passing. The dawn was about to break. The world had been fundamentally changed. The famines and migrations had redrawn the map. The new inventions and ideas had set the stage for future revolutions. The scars of the crisis would remain for a generation. But the cause of the crisis, the great stratospheric veil, was beginning to dissipate. The trillions of tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, which had dimmed the sun for so long, were now beginning their slow descent back to Earth. The planet was beginning the process of healing itself. The people below, unaware of the atmospheric chemistry taking place high above them, would soon feel its effects. The change was not sudden. It was not like a switch being flipped. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process. It was like waking from a long and feverish dream. The summers of 1817 and 1818 were still cooler than average in many places, but they were not the catastrophic failures of 1816. The rains were less relentless. The frosts were less severe. The sun seemed to shine with a little more of its old, familiar warmth. For the first time in years, farmers could plant a crop with a reasonable expectation that it would grow. The rhythm of the seasons, so violently disrupted, was slowly beginning to find its tempo once again. The slow return of normal weather was met not with celebration, but with a kind of weary relief. People were too exhausted, too impoverished by the preceding years of hardship to rejoice. They simply got on with the difficult business of rebuilding their lives. They planted their fields, tended their livestock, and slowly began to fill their empty granaries. The poverty year was over, but its memory lingered. It became a dark folk tale, a benchmark of hardship against which all other difficult years would be measured. It was the year their grandparents talked about, the year the sun had refused to shine out as we move into this final, gentle part of our story. Let the sense of crisis fall away. The human drama of survival and innovation gives way now to a quieter, more planetary story. It is a story of atmospheric cleansing and of the slow, steady march of time. The world of 1816 is fading back into the mists of history, but the lessons it holds are timeless. They speak of a planet that is more connected and more powerful than we can often imagine. So let your mind be calm and let us watch together as the light slowly returns to the world. High above the world, in the cold, calm expanse of the stratosphere, a slow and silent cleansing was underway. The great veil of sulfate aerosols, which had shrouded the planet for 3 years, was beginning to dissipate. The force of gravity, patient and relentless, was gently pulling the tiny droplets downward. One by one, they descended from the stable stratosphere into the turbulent troposphere below. Once they reached this lower layer, the layer of clouds and weather, they were quickly washed out of the sky by rain. The planet was, in essence, giving itself a long, slow shower, rinsing the last remnants of Tambora's fury from its atmosphere. This process was gradual, taking several years to complete. But on the ground, the effects were becoming noticeable. The summer of 1817 was still cool, but it was a recognizable summer. The summer of 1818 was better still. The sun, for the first time in years, seemed to shine with its old, familiar intensity. Its warmth could be felt on the skin, a simple, profound comfort that had been sorely missed. The sky began to shed its hazy, whitish pallor, returning to a deeper, more reassuring shade of blue. The eerie, fiery sunsets began to fade, replaced by the softer, more gentle colors of a normal evening dot. With the return of the sun came the return of life's familiar rhythms. The growing seasons, which had been so dangerously shortened, began to lengthen again. Farmers planted their crops with a renewed, if cautious, sense of hope. The sight of healthy, green shoots of corn reaching for the sky was a miracle in itself. The hay grew tall in the meadows. The eerie silence of 1816 was broken by the returning buzz of insects and the cheerful song of birds. The world, which had seemed so sick and alien, was slowly returning to health. It was a quiet, uncelebrated convalescence. For the people who had lived through it, the year without a summer became a dark and powerful memory. It was a benchmark for hardship, a story to be told to children and grandchildren. They called it by many names, names that spoke of local suffering. In New England, it was 1800 and froze to death. In Germany, it was the year of the beggar. Each region had its own name for the trauma, its own local folklore. But no one at the time understood that these were all just different names for the same single global event. The true scale of the crisis remained a mystery, and so a strange historical amnesia began to set in. Without a global communication network, and without a scientific explanation, the story of 1816 became fragmented. It was remembered as a collection of local weather anomalies, not as a planetary climate catastrophe. The crucial link, the eruption of Mount Tambora, was completely unknown to the sufferers. The event was simply too big, too strange, and too far outside the realm of their understanding to be pieced together. The greatest climate disaster of the last millennium faded from the pages of history, remembered only in folklore and in the obscure data of weather journals. For over a century, the mystery lay dormant. The story of Tambora was a footnote in the colonial reports from the Dutch East Indies. The story of the global famine was a collection of scattered anecdotes. There was no thread to connect them. But the Earth keeps its own records. The planet does not forget. And in the 20th century, scientists began to learn how to read its most detailed and ancient diaries. They found these diaries written in a place of extreme cold and solitude. They found them written in the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. The science that would finally solve the mystery was called paleoclimatology. The key to this science is the ice core. Imagine a place where snow falls every year but never melts. Over thousands of years, the layers of snow build up, compressing the older layers below into solid ice. By drilling deep into these glaciers, scientists can extract long cylindrical cores of this ancient ice. These cores are like a timeline, a perfect, frozen record of the Earth's atmosphere going back hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer represents a single year's snowfall, and trapped within each layer are tiny air bubbles and chemical traces of whatever was in the atmosphere at that time. In the 1970s and 80s, as scientists began to analyze these ice cores with increasing precision, they started to notice something remarkable. They could see evidence of past volcanic eruptions recorded in the ice. A large eruption that injects sulfur into the stratosphere leaves behind a clear chemical fingerprint. When the sulfate aerosols eventually fall out of the atmosphere, they land on the ice sheets and become trapped in that year's layer of snow. This leaves a distinct layer of high acidity in the ice core. The ice, in effect, records a ghost image of the volcanic veil. As they drill deeper back into the layers of the early 19th century, they found a layer of acidity that was off the charts. It was a massive spike, far larger than any other. For thousands of years, the date of this acidic layer was unmistakable. It corresponded to the years following 1815. This was the smoking gun. It was the physical proof that a colossal, sulfur-rich volcanic eruption had occurred just before the year without a summer. The ice core data provided a clear, global signal that connected the suffering of 1816 to a single massive volcanic event. Now, historians and climatologists had the thread they needed. They could go back to the historical records with this new knowledge. They revisited the colonial reports from Indonesia and found the accounts of Tambora's eruption. They combed through old ship logs, weather diaries, and economic records from around the world. Suddenly, the fragmented stories began to make sense. The snow in Vermont, the floods in Switzerland, the famine in China, and the acid layer in the Greenland ice were not separate events. They were all ripples spreading out from the same single epicenter of disruption, the eruption of Mount Tambora. Great forgetting was over. The mystery was finally solved, not by the people who lived it, but by generations of scientists who came long after them. This rediscovery is a profound story in itself. It is a testament to human curiosity and our persistent desire to understand the past. The work of these scientists gave a voice to the millions who suffered without an explanation. It gave them, and us, the full context for their tragedy. It allowed us to finally see the year without a summer for what it was, a powerful and humbling lesson in planetary interconnectedness. This new understanding also allows us to look at the historical consequences with a clearer eye. The famines, the migrations, the social unrest, the inventions, the literary creations, all of it could now be seen in the context of this global climate shock. It provided a new lens through which to view history, demonstrating how a single event in the Earth's natural systems could profoundly influence the course of human civilization. The story was no longer just about weather. It was about the intricate and often invisible dance between our planet and the people who inhabit it. The knowledge we have now is a privilege. We can look back and understand the chain of cause and effect, but it is a humbling knowledge. It reminds us that our complex, modern world is still fundamentally dependent on the same stable climate that our ancestors were. The forces that drove the Tambora event have not gone away. The Earth's capacity for sudden, dramatic change is an inherent part of its nature. The story of 1816 serves as a powerful cautionary tale, a message written in ice and in the historical record of human suffering. As the veil of Tambora thinned and the world began its slow recovery, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The sun shone warmly again. The harvests returned. The raw, desperate edge of survival began to soften. But the world had been forever changed. The people who had lived through the darkness carried its memory with them. The societies that had endured the crisis were reshaped by it. And the planet itself carried on, its atmosphere cleansed, holding the secret of what had happened for another 150 years. The final part of our story is to reflect on what that secret means for us today. We now live with the knowledge that the people of 1816 lacked. We can look back through the clear lens of science and understand the full chain of events. We understand the chemistry of volcanoes, the physics of the stratosphere, and the intricate connections that make up our global climate system. It is easy to take this knowledge for granted, but it is a profound gift purchased through centuries of curiosity and discovery. To live in a world that can be understood, that can be measured and modeled, is a great privilege. It allows us to replace fear with awareness and superstition with a quiet sense of awe. This knowledge, however, is also a great responsibility. The story of Tambora is not just a historical curiosity, a strange tale from a distant past. It is a profound and timeless lesson about the planet we call home. It speaks of a world that is far more intimately connected than we often perceive in our daily lives. It asks us to see the world not as a collection of separate places, but as a single breathing system. A most powerful lesson is one of unity. The air you are breathing right now, in the quiet of your room, is part of a single shared atmosphere. It is a vast, invisible ocean that blankets the entire earth, a fluid medium in which we all live. The winds that circulate high above us are the planet's circulatory system. They know nothing of the borders we draw on maps. An event that happens in one hemisphere will inevitably, eventually, have consequences in the other. The sulfate veil from Tambora was a stark and undeniable demonstration of this truth. Think of it. The sulfur that erupted from a mountain in Indonesia on a single day in April 1815 became part of the air breathed by people in England months later. The lives of a Chinese farmer watching his rice paddies fail, and an Irish laborer watching. The potatoes rot were invisibly linked by these tiny reflective particles in the sky. They shared the same misfortune, born from the same event, without ever knowing of each other's existence. They were bound together by the air itself. This deep interconnectedness reveals our profound fragility. The complex global civilization we have built, with all of its marvels, relies on a remarkably narrow set of environmental conditions. For all our technology and progress, we are still deeply dependent on the predictable rhythm of the seasons. We depend on the warmth of the sun and on the stability of a climate that operates within a very specific life-sustaining range. Year without a summer showed how quickly the foundations of society can crack when those conditions are altered, even by a small percentage dot. The global famine was a direct result of a slight, temporary change in the Earth's energy balance. It is a humbling reminder that we are not separate from nature, but are an inextricable part of it. We are not masters of our environment, so much as its fortunate beneficiaries. Our existence is a delicate dance, a partnership with the forces of the planet. And when the planet's rhythm changes, we too must change our steps. Yet the story is also one of incredible resilience. This is perhaps the most hopeful lesson from that dark time. Humanity was battered by the crisis, but it was not broken. This resilience showed itself on many scales. It was in the quiet determination of a single family, deciding to abandon a cursed farm and walk 1,000 miles toward an uncertain future. It was in the spirit of communities that, though strained to the breaking point, eventually found ways to support one another and rebuild. And it was in the resilience of the human mind. When faced with starvation, people did not just give up. They migrated seeking new lands. One, when faced with new problems, like the loss of their horses, they invented new solutions, like the first bicycle, a symbol of self-propulsion and hope. And when faced with overwhelming gloom and despair, they retreated inward and created art and literature of enduring power. It shows a capacity within the human spirit to not only survive hardship, but to transform it into something new, something lasting. In our modern world, the lessons of Tambora resonate with a new and powerful significance. We are more aware than ever of how the actions taken in one part of the world can affect everyone else. We understand that our shared atmosphere is a delicate and vital system. The story of 1816 is a historical case study, a message from the past about the consequences of rapid climate change. It reminds us that our planet is a dynamic and powerful entity, and that its balance, once disturbed, can lead to unforeseen and far-reaching effects on human lives. As we bring our long journey to a close, let us rest with these reflections. The world of 1816, with its strange twilight and its profound suffering, has faded back into the past. The volcanic veil has long since dissipated. The fields are green again, and the sun shines with its familiar warmth. The story is over. But its echoes remain. They remain in the history of westward expansion, in the design of the bicycle, and in the timeless horror of Frankenstein's monster, a creature born of a dark and stormy summer. They remain, most clearly of all, in the layers of the Greenland. Ice sheet, a silent witness, a frozen library holding the chemical memory of the year the sun vanished. The world eventually found its equilibrium again. The slow, cyclical dance of the seasons resumed its ancient rhythm. Warmth followed the cold. Light followed the darkness. This is the enduring promise of our planet. It is a system that is both powerful in its disruptions and powerful in its capacity for recovery. There is a deep and quiet comfort in this knowledge. The challenges we face are often great, but the capacity for healing, both in our world and in ourselves, is also great. The light eventually always returns. Our story is now at its end. We have traveled from the snows of a New England summer to the fiery heart of an Indonesian volcano. We have witnessed famine and despair, but also ingenuity and creation. We have journeyed through the science of the stratosphere and into the depths of the human heart. Thank you for spending this time with me, for allowing your mind to drift through this forgotten chapter of our shared history. I hope this story has brought you some measure of peace and a deeper appreciation for the quiet, steady world that lies just outside your window. As our journey together concludes, and the world of 1816 fades completely into the mists of time, may you find comfort in the quiet of this present moment. Let the story dissolve and allow your mind to become still. Let go of the thoughts of the day, of the lists and the worries. Feel the gentle pull of rest. The great interconnected world will continue its silent turning, as it has for ages. You have played your part today, and you can rest now, secure in the knowledge that after every long night, the sun returns. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Sleep well.